Ever since I turned 40, people kept asking if I'd finally hit that proverbial midlife crisis. I'd chuckle, brush them off with a nah, my life's the good kind of boring, and give them the same rundown: married 15 years, 2 teenagers, a 9 to 5 in finance. Not too exciting, but not exactly a crisis either. My wife, Lauren, a high school teacher, kept things running at home with the precision of a seasoned airline pilot. We didn't have drama, we had structure. And while the word thrilling might be ambitious for our relationship, I'd have called it solid. Trustworthy. Until that Friday night. It was one of those endless, stuffy work functions I never looked forward to. A charity dinner at a bland hotel ballroom, endless rows of identical suits and cocktail dresses, every table sporting the same floral arrangement like a production line for rich people's parties. I'd brought Lauren along as a show of support for my boss. She was polite, perfectly poised, and as professional as ever, wearing her trusty black dress with that understated gold necklace I'd given her for our 10th anniversary. Then Alex showed up. Alex, the shiny new guy in sales, was the type who strutted into the room as if he owned every piece of real estate his Italian loafers touched. Mid-30s, decent-looking in an arrogant sort of way, with a kind of beard that looked like it required a full-time groomer. I barely knew him, aside from his reputation as the closer. He was one of those charmers whose every gesture seemed engineered to work on a particular demographic, one that clearly included my wife. Lauren lit up when he walked over. Now, I don't mean a soft smile or a friendly nod. She was practically glowing. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, more curious than anything. I mean, Lauren isn't the glowing type. She's efficient, dependable, and I'd thought unflappable. Think of a trusted nurse rather than the social butterfly. But there she was, laughing, flashing smiles, and giving him these looks I hadn't seen in years. I felt like an outsider in my own marriage, standing there nursing a watered-down whiskey as my wife engaged in an apparently thrilling conversation with a man she'd just met. She laughed at something he said, a sound that seemed somehow foreign, and she touched his arm, leaning in just a bit too close. Now, I'm not some possessive caveman. I don't care if my wife talks to another man. But as she threw her head back in another peal of laughter, I started seeing things with an odd clarity. Like when you take your car in for a routine check and the mechanic mentions there's a strange noise you hadn't noticed, but suddenly it's all you can hear. That's what Lauren was to me right then. A car with a faint, unfamiliar rattle. I brushed it off, told myself it was nothing. Probably just my imagination, or maybe a side effect of that mediocre whiskey. We drove home in silence, my mind replaying the night like a glitching record. She talked about the fundraiser, the food, her friends from work, standard post-event talk. I nodded, throwing in a few ahas, but my mind kept drifting back to that arm touch, the laugh, the looks. The following morning, I found her already up, unusually spry for a Saturday. She claimed she'd taken an interest in yoga, saying something about centering herself. In all our years together, Lauren's idea of exercise had never gone past the occasional brisk walk. Now she was spending Saturdays at some boutique studio 2 towns over. I didn't think too much of it. People reinvent themselves all the time, right? I didn't ask, and she didn't elaborate. Our routine slid along, much as they always had, but I couldn't shake that nagging feeling. It was like I'd tuned into a frequency I hadn't noticed before, one broadcasting strange signals at every turn. The rattle got louder the following week. Lauren started dressing up a bit more for work, taking an extra 5 minutes on her hair, touching up her lipstick after dinner, which frankly, was an odd move when she usually put her pajamas on right after dessert. I didn't say anything. Just observed, like a scientist might watch a specimen start to exhibit new and unexpected behaviors. And to be honest, I half wondered if I was imagining things. After all, it's easy to turn every little detail into a red flag when you're already looking for them. But that Friday night at the charity event? The laugh, the arm touch, the way her eyes seemed to lock onto Alex like he was the only man in the room? That wasn't my imagination. It was something new, something real, like the first crack in a vase you thought was flawless. By the following weekend, I'd started assembling mental puzzle pieces. It wasn't that I thought she was cheating. It was more of a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I had no evidence, nothing solid, but the signs were starting to stack up. Funny thing, though, the idea didn't even make me mad. If anything, it left me curious, like an itch I couldn't scratch. And in a way, I almost welcomed the intrigue. After all, it had been years since anything had jolted me awake from the lull of routine. I'll be the first to admit I'm not the most observant guy. I'm not Sherlock Holmes, piecing together micro-evidence from stray hairs on a coat or catching a whiff of unfamiliar cologne. I'm more of a notice when the fridge stops running kind of guy, mostly because of the silence. But when things around Lauren started changing, even I couldn't ignore it. Her Saturday yoga classes quickly morphed from a 1-hour session into 2-hour retreats that involved her grabbing lunch with a friend from class. This supposed friend didn't have a name, which felt strange given Lauren's usual overshare tendencies. Every new development in her life generally came with a full cast of characters: Betty from spin class, Rachel from PTA, Greg from the dog park. But now, just a friend. Pretty convenient. Then there was her sudden interest in fitness. Now don't get me wrong, I applaud anyone trying to improve themselves, but Lauren's transformation into a fitness enthusiast was about as believable as a cat taking up swimming. She'd always been more active listener than active participant. Yet now, she was all about her health journey. She bought a couple of new outfits, leggings, tank tops that were, shall we say, oddly flattering, and even invested in an Apple Watch, the one with the fancy fitness tracker. Before I knew it, she was closing her rings every day, tracking her steps like her life depended on it. And then there was her phone. I started noticing it was never more than an inch away from her. Once upon a time, her phone would be tossed onto the kitchen counter, abandoned for hours. Now it was glued to her side, face down, notifications silenced. And when it wasn't on silent, there was a new discrete vibration she'd programmed just for texts. I mean, who needs their own custom vibration for texts if they don't want to know exactly who's contacting them before they even look? I wasn't exactly a tech whiz, but even I could tell she'd started a sort of double life with that phone. One day, she left it on the bathroom sink when she ran downstairs to grab a drink. I stared at it like it was a rattlesnake. For a second, I considered flipping it over and taking a peek. But call it pride, stupidity, or just plain exhaustion, I decided against it. I guess part of me didn't want to know, at least not yet. I wasn't ready to break the seal on whatever secrets she'd started keeping. Not without a game plan. A few more weeks passed. By now her yoga Saturdays were a regular fixture, and her work hours had extended too. Apparently, the school board had launched some new initiatives that required her to stay after hours. I knew better than to question it out loud. No one wants to be the guy sitting at the kitchen table accusing their wife of something without proof. I just let it slide, pretending to believe that the world suddenly needed Lauren to stay back until 7:30 on a Wednesday night to review lesson plans. One night, as we lay in bed, I watched her scroll through her phone, smiling. I asked her casually, "So, who's making you smile like that?" She froze, her smile evaporating as if it had been scrubbed out by some industrial strength cleaner. She looked at me with this sort of fake amusement, saying, "Oh, just a funny meme from Rachel." "Ah, Rachel from PTA?" I asked, pretending I hadn't detected the lie. She nodded, far too quickly. "Yeah, we send each other stuff like that all the time." Thing is, I'd seen Rachel at the last school event. She's the kind of mom who considers the Oxford come-up elitist. Not exactly a meme-sharing type. Still, I nodded, and that was that. But from that night on, I knew I'd crossed a line in Lauren's head, the line where I was no longer Daniel, her oblivious husband, but Daniel, a potential threat. She grew even more careful with her phone, more evasive with her Saturday plans. Then came the girls' night. One Friday, Lauren announced over dinner that she was going out with a few women from work for a much-needed night of unwinding. She said it like it was a big deal, and she made sure to over-explain who was going. 3 teachers she'd supposedly known for years. I wasn't invited, naturally, but I didn't care. As far as I was concerned, I had the evening to myself, a rare luxury. She wore a new dress that night, one I hadn't seen before, a bit too chic for a casual night with the girls. I raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. At 11:30, I got curious. She still wasn't home. I sent her a quick text, "All good." She didn't reply until around midnight. "Yes, sorry, one of the girls had a bit too much wine. We're just getting her home." It wasn't until almost 2 a.m. that I heard her quietly open the front door, her shoes in her hand as she tiptoed inside. I lay there, pretending to be asleep, waiting to see if she'd say something. She didn't. I caught a faint whiff of cologne that certainly didn't belong to me, and she slid into bed without a word. She fell asleep almost instantly, or at least she pretended to. The next morning, she acted as if nothing unusual had happened. She rattled on about her friend Carol from work, who'd apparently had one too many margaritas and needed help getting home. She spun a tale so intricate, she even added details about Carol's messy breakup, some supposed teary confessions, and how they'd all rallied to support her. As if she were a Hollywood screenwriter, fleshing out a character's backstory to make her lie seem more believable. She clearly expected me to ask for the whole rundown. I didn't. I nodded and let her ramble, absorbing every word. Because by then I had decided, if she was going to make me the fool, she'd at least have to work for it. That Saturday, I did something I'd never thought I'd do. I called in a favor from an old buddy who'd gone into private investigations after we both left college. A couple of hours later, he was at my door with a cup of coffee and a knowing look. "So you think she's got someone else?" he asked, deadpan. "I don't know," I said, feeling a bit embarrassed to even be saying it out loud. "Just, things aren't adding up." He looked at me thoughtfully, giving a slight nod. "You want me to check it out?" "Nothing crazy. Just, see if she's where she says she is." He agreed, quietly, professionally. I hadn't heard from him in years, but there he was, ready to uncover whatever secrets Lauren thought she could keep from me. He was low-key, discreet, and unfailingly thorough. If there was something to find, he'd find it. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. 15 years of a decent marriage, and here I was, calling in a detective like some private eye thriller protagonist. But this wasn't a movie. This was my life, and I had no interest in a dramatic confrontation or some sordid tale of betrayal. All I wanted was the truth, whatever that might mean. Whether it was good, bad, or completely absurd, I was ready to hear it. A week later, my buddy called me back with the preliminary findings. If I had thought life was moving in strange directions before, my friend's call proved me wrong. He'd only been looking into Lauren's movements for a week, and already he sounded like he'd uncovered enough drama for a season finale. As I listened to his dry, methodical rundown, I started to wonder if I'd somehow been the last to catch on to my own life. "Your wife's routine is, let's say, less straightforward than you'd think," he started, which I already found more unsettling than I cared to admit. Turns out, Lauren's new yoga Saturdays were indeed happening, but in a different form than advertised. She wasn't driving to the studio 2 towns over. In fact, she was skipping town entirely, hopping onto the interstate and driving 45 minutes out to a cozy little coffee shop, an unassuming spot that wasn't the least bit suspicious, until you counted the number of times she met a specific friend there. "You're not going to believe it," he said, his tone a mix of amusement and exasperation. "She's been meeting a guy there every Saturday. Same guy each time." I felt a grim sense of vindication. "Let me guess. Tall, 30-something, beard that screams, takes himself too seriously?" He laughed. "Yeah, I'd say that's a fair description. Real, urban lumberjack type. Drives a red sports car, if that tells you anything. Alex." I almost laughed at the cliché of it, but instead, I felt an unexpected numbness settle in. This wasn't just a coincidence. She was actively, meticulously lying to me every weekend to spend time with this walking stereotype. And I'd been buying it. Well, sort of. "Can you send me any photos?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. "Just, so I know." An hour later, he sent me a few shots. Nothing incriminating, exactly, just her and Alex sitting close at a small table in a way that left little room for ambiguity. One of her laughing at something he'd said, another of him leaning in with that trademark smirk. Lauren looked younger somehow, as if she'd peeled back 10 years for this coffee date, shedding our comfortable, shared life to slip into the skin of a woman I didn't recognize. I closed the photos, feeling a strange mixture of anger, confusion, and surprisingly, a hint of curiosity. What was it, exactly, that had drawn her to him? I mean, he wasn't awful to look at, but he had the depth of a puddle. I should know. I'd had the misfortune of sitting through his entire spiel on investment portfolios at that charity event, which was less enlightening than a brochure for tax-free savings accounts. That evening, Lauren returned home with her usual breezy yoga glow, a shopping bag in hand and an unconvincing excuse about picking up a new mat. As she walked into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine, I caught her looking at her phone, smiling that small secret smile. She probably thought I was oblivious, standing there in the hallway, watching her act out her little charade. The irony was, it didn't even feel like my marriage anymore, more like I'd stumbled onto some B-rated TV show, complete with poorly written excuses and tired plot twists. Still, I waited. I'd started to see her behavior as an experiment, one where she was the unwitting participant. Each Saturday brought another yoga session, another brunch with the girls, or some flimsy reason to stay out late. She'd grown so used to my disinterest, my predictably casual routine, that she didn't even look back as she slid out the door. A couple of weeks went by, and each Saturday, my buddy checked in with updates. Lauren and Alex went from coffee shops to a hotel out in a neighboring town. The first time I heard about it, I'd braced myself, half hoping he was mistaken. But, of course, he wasn't. Every time, she booked the same room, 312, as if I wouldn't notice her absences or worse, as if she believed I wouldn't care. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I finally decided it was time to end the waiting game. I told my friend that I'd be going down there myself that day. I'd see it with my own eyes, give her the benefit of a doubt that she didn't deserve but that I needed to give, for my own sake if nothing else. I drove to the hotel and parked a discreet distance away, watching the entrance from my car. I wasn't sure how long I'd be waiting or if I'd even have the guts to get out and go in. But a few minutes later, Lauren's car pulled in, with Alex's sporty red Disaster not far behind. They got out, each moving as if they were operating on instinct, like they were as familiar with the routine as they were with each other. She gave him a quick, private smile before heading inside. Watching them disappear through those glass doors, I felt the final piece click into place. This wasn't just a random fling or some desperate attempt at finding herself. No, Lauren knew exactly what she was doing, and she'd planned every lie, every little cover story, with the precision of a seasoned pro. I gave them 20 minutes, then made my way inside. The hotel lobby was as bland as you'd expect, all neutrals and forced elegance, designed to make you forget you were paying too much for too little. I went straight for the elevators and pressed the button for the third floor, every second of that ride stretching like an eternity. Room 312 loomed ahead of me as I walked down the hallway, looking like every other door in every other generic hotel. Yet somehow, it held the sum total of the last 15 years of my life. I stood outside, unsure whether I'd knock or simply turn and leave. But before I could make a decision, the door opened, and there was Lauren, standing with Alex behind her, looking startled, like a deer caught in headlights. Her face went through a catalog of emotions in those first few seconds: shock, guilt, anger, and most infuriatingly, a flicker of defiance. I could almost hear her gears turning, the excuses forming even as she opened her mouth. But I didn't give her the chance. "Funny running into you here, Lauren," I said, a smile I didn't feel stretching across my face. I was just in the area, thought I'd say hi. Alex looked like he was about to slink away, which would have been my preference, but he held his ground. Lauren's expression hardened, her mouth opening to say something. I could only imagine what. Maybe she'd try to pull that soul connection line out, or some weak defense about how I'd made her feel distant. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she said finally, sounding as rehearsed as I'd expected. "Really? Because you've been leaving a trail a mile wide. Honestly, I thought you wanted me to find out." My tone was calm, even a little amused, which only seemed to irritate her further. Alex cleared his throat, looking at me like he'd suddenly realized this wasn't the free pass he'd assumed. "Maybe we should, give you 2 minutes?" I raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe you should take this as a chance to get out before things get complicated." He glanced at Lauren, who shot him a silent plea, one I recognized from years of team parenting at family functions. It was the look she'd give me when she wanted me to cover for her, to let her say she'd handled things on her own. But this time, I wasn't playing backup. "Actually, Alex, I think we're good here," I said, nodding toward the elevator. He gave Lauren one last look, and I could almost hear the "sorry, but I'm not getting dragged into this" in his retreat. When he'd finally scurried off, Lauren turned to me, and I knew the speech was coming. The practiced words, the rationalizations she'd rehearsed in the mirror. But I wasn't here to hear her excuses or to play along with her flimsy defense. Save it, Lauren. I'm not interested in whatever version of this story you want me to believe. For once, she had no comeback. Her mouth closed, the look in her eyes shifting to something like desperation. But I'd had enough. I walked away without waiting to hear her say another word, leaving her standing alone in the hallway of that bland hotel. I didn't even look back. As I left the hotel, I felt something close to relief. It was strange, how light I felt, like I'd finally put down a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. I'd have some choices to make, for sure. But one thing was certain, whatever story she wanted to tell herself about her life, I wouldn't be part of it. The drive home was surprisingly calm. I didn't feel much at all, really, no anger, no heartbreak. Just a strange kind of stillness. I was so accustomed to life as a series of routines, expectations, and assumptions, that I'd barely registered the void my marriage had turned into. Catching her with Alex was like taking a knife to a frozen lake, cracking open a surface that had long stopped feeling like home. Lauren didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. She knew that her usual girls' night excuse was beyond salvageable. My phone buzzed around 10, a text from her. Can we talk? I'll come by in the morning. I didn't reply. Let her sit with the silence for a change. The next morning, she came through the door looking like someone who'd spent the night rehearsing, maybe even convincing herself that there was some magic combination of words that would make it all better. Her face wore an expression of forced calm, the kind that hinted she'd put herself together in front of a mirror before coming in to face me. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee mug in hand, watching her like she was some kind of abstract art piece I couldn't quite figure out. She dropped her bag on a chair and let out a sigh, though it sounded more frustrated than apologetic. I know you're upset, she started. I almost laughed. Upset? No, I was long past upset. I was somewhere in the ballpark of clinical detachment, a safe distance where I could observe her performance without so much as a flicker of emotion. She seemed thrown off by my silence, but after a pause, she pressed on. Look, Daniel, I know this isn't what you expected, but... Save it, Lauren. I set my coffee down and looked her straight in the eye. Let's skip the part where you explain yourself. I don't need to hear it. She blinked, clearly caught off guard. It was as if my refusal to entertain her excuses left her scrambling for a foothold. You don't even want to know why, she asked, sounding almost offended. Why? I leaned back, crossing my arms. Why, Lauren? You think some story about needing excitement or feeling alive is going to change what happened? For the first time, she looked uncomfortable. Her gaze shifted to her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. It started out innocent. I thought Alex and I were just friends, but then, she trailed off, as if words had failed her. Let me guess. I gave her a deadpan look. It just happened. The same way you just happened to plan your lies, pick your alibis, and book the same hotel room week after week. The flicker of defiance returned to her eyes. I know you're hurt, but don't act like you're some perfect husband. We've been coasting for years, Daniel. You barely even look at me anymore. I almost laughed at the audacity. Oh, so it's my fault now? You cheat on me because I didn't make enough heart eyes at you over breakfast. She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't let her. I wasn't here to indulge her twisted logic. Lauren, I don't care what you thought was missing. You made a choice, a dozen choices, in fact, every time you lied, covered your tracks, and ran off to be with him. If you were so unhappy, you could have left. But instead, you decided to lie to my face, week after week, and then what? You thought I'd just take you back when it all fell apart. The mask slipped, and for a moment, I saw a flash of raw panic. It was the first genuine reaction I'd seen from her since I'd caught her with Alex, and it almost felt satisfying. Daniel, please. Her voice softened, a pleading note slipping through. I know I made a mistake, but I don't want to throw everything away. We have a life together. The kids, our home. This doesn't have to be the end. I laughed, a bitter sound that even surprised me. Oh, so now you want to save the marriage? Now that you're caught, you want to preserve the family. I was confused, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. I was lonely. And somehow, instead of talking to me, you thought a few nights with Alex would fix that? I shook my head, incredulous. What were you thinking, Lauren? That this wouldn't come out? Or that, if it did, I'd just shrug and pretend nothing happened? She looked away, visibly wilting under the weight of her own excuses. It was strange. She was so accustomed to being the sensible, grounded one, the level-headed wife and mother. Watching her flounder, realizing that she had zero control over this narrative, brought a grim sense of justice. Daniel, please, she murmured again, her voice low, desperate. Can we work through this? We can get counseling, try to rebuild. I don't want to lose everything over a mistake. I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between us. Maybe a part of me should have felt some pull to her plea, some flicker of affection from the years we'd spent together, but all I felt was numb. Lauren, this wasn't a mistake. A mistake is leaving the oven on or forgetting to pay a bill. What you did was a series of deliberate choices, each one a lie you brought home to me. The reality of my words seemed to sink in, and she deflated, any pretense of defense slipping away. She looked small, defeated, almost like she was seeing the magnitude of what she'd done for the first time. But even then, I wasn't about to let her make this about her regrets. Here's the thing, Lauren, I said quietly. I don't hate you. I'm not even angry anymore. I'm just done. This version of us? It's over. I'll give you as clean a split as possible for the kid's sake. But don't ask me to pretend this can ever be fixed. Her face paled as she registered the finality of my words. But Daniel, the kids, our life. We'll figure it out, I said, a note of calm finality in my tone. I'll move out for now, and we'll work out the rest through the lawyers. It's over, Lauren. You made sure of that. A long silence settled between us, one punctuated only by the faint hum of the fridge and the ticking of the kitchen clock. For a split second, I thought she might try to argue, throw out one last desperate plea. But she just sat there, her hands wringing in her lap, staring at the floor as if the weight of her own actions had finally crushed her. With that, I got up and headed upstairs. I packed a bag, just the basics, clothes, toiletries, a few essentials. I didn't need much. This was just the first step in a process that would take weeks, months even, but I'd made my decision. There was no going back. As I walked out the door, bag slung over my shoulder, Lauren just sat there, watching me go, her face blank and empty. She didn't call out, didn't follow me, didn't try to stop me. I suppose she knew there wasn't much left to say. I reached the driveway, feeling the chilly morning air prick at my skin. And that's when it hit me, a faint sense of freedom, like stepping out of a shadow I hadn't realized I'd been standing under. It wasn't happiness or triumph, but a kind of clarity, a lightness that comes from finally shedding a layer of your life that no longer fits. For 15 years, I'd been Daniel, the husband, the reliable one, the comfortable fixture in Lauren's well-ordered life. And now? Now I had no idea who I was supposed to be, or what was waiting on the other side of this mess. But one thing was certain, whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be a life lived in the shadow of lies and second chances that didn't mean a thing. As I started my car, I took one last look back at the house, a place I'd always thought of as home, filled with memories I'd once treasured. But as I watched Lauren standing in the window, a small figure lost in her own private world, it struck me that maybe home had never really been the house or even the marriage. Maybe it was something I'd been carrying alone all along, a part of myself I hadn't recognized until now. With a final glance at the empty driveway, I pulled away, feeling a strange but undeniable sense of relief wash over me. I was stepping into something new, something uncertain, and for once, I was ready to meet it head-on. For the first few days after I left, I was half expecting to wake up in my old bed, as if none of this had happened, as if leaving was just another bizarre part of a dream that would fade by morning. But every time I opened my eyes, I found myself staring at the drab ceiling of a cheap hotel room. It wasn't much, just 4 walls, a squeaky bed, and a coffee maker that spat out lukewarm sludge instead of actual coffee. But for now, it was enough. Lauren texted a few times, each message more tentative than the last. First, it was, "Can we just talk?" Then, "The kids are asking about you." And eventually, I know I screwed up, Daniel. Can't we work this out? I ignored her. It wasn't that I had nothing to say, I had plenty. But the more I sat there, reading her apologies, the less I felt the need to respond. What could I say that I hadn't already said in that kitchen, watching her face as I walked out the door? After a few days, I decided it was time to find something more permanent. Living out of a suitcase was starting to wear thin, and I had no intention of staying in that hotel room forever. I called a friend of mine, Mike, who had a rental property downtown, a small apartment in a building mostly populated by other middle-aged men who were either between jobs, between marriages, or both. Dan, you're in luck, Mike said over the phone. Got a unit opening up in a week. It's not exactly the Ritz, but it's clean and cheap. Perfect, I said, relief washing over me. I'll take it. 1 week later, I was moving into a small one-bedroom apartment with a kind of bare-bones furniture that looked like it had been lifted from a yard sale. The walls were a dull beige, the carpet a shade of gray that had seen better decades, but at least I had my own space. For the first time in years, I could wake up and go to bed without feeling like I was living someone else's life. A few days after I'd settled in, Lauren texted again. This time, her message was short. Let's meet to discuss the next steps. For the kids. I replied, agreeing to meet her at a quiet coffee shop we both knew. Neutral ground. She arrived right on time, looking as put together as ever, though there was a hint of something in her face. Tiredness, maybe, or the strain of holding it all together. She sat down across from me, stirring her coffee absently before looking up with a hesitant smile. Daniel. I know I've said it already, but I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I raised an eyebrow, my tone dry. You never meant for it to go this far? So, how far was it supposed to go, exactly? She faltered, her cheeks flushing, and I knew I'd caught her off guard. But at this point, I didn't care much about sparing her feelings. Daniel, I don't expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice low. But can we at least try to make this easy for the kids? They're confused, and I don't want them to suffer because of my mistakes. I nodded, taking a deep breath. She was right about that, at least. Our kids didn't deserve to be dragged through a battlefield just because their mother had decided to play house with someone else. So we talked logistics, when I'd see them, how we'd handle school schedules, holidays, the works. It was clinical, impersonal, as if we were negotiating a business deal instead of unraveling a decade and a half of marriage. As we hashed out the details, I caught myself glancing at her hands, the same hands that had once held mine, that I'd watched as she'd nervously twisted her wedding ring the day we said our vows. Now they were clasped tightly, fingers tense as if trying to keep herself from unraveling. We were nearly finished when she hesitated, her eyes dropping to the table. Daniel, there's something I wanted to ask. I know I don't have the right, but would you ever consider giving us another chance? For the kids. I stared at her, processing the question. Another chance. That's what she thought this was all about, a simple decision to press rewind, as if 15 years and a few months of betrayal could be erased like a chalkboard. I let her question hang in the air, heavy and unanswered, until she finally met my gaze. No, Lauren. I don't think that's an option, I said quietly. We can work together to make things as smooth as possible for the kids. But us? That's done. You saw to that. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw the hint of regret in her face, a flicker of something real behind the practiced poise. She looked like she might argue, might say something to try and sway me. But instead, she just nodded, accepting the finality of it. As we wrapped up, I paid for our coffees, feeling strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's life from a distance. We agreed to start splitting the weeks with the kids, giving them as much stability as possible. We made our polite goodbyes, our voices courteous, our expressions neutral. When I watched her walk out of that coffee shop, it felt like closing the door on a chapter one hadn't fully realized was over. That evening, back in my new apartment, I sat on my sagging couch, staring out the window at the unfamiliar city skyline. For so long, my life had been defined by predictability, routines, plans for the future. Now the future was a blank slate, a rare, intimidating thing. I had no idea what was coming next, no idea what kind of life I'd pieced together from the fragments. There was a knock at the door, breaking my train of thought. I opened it to find Mike standing there, a six-pack of beer in hand, his face wearing a sympathetic grin. "Thought you could use a drink," he said, walking in before I could even answer. I laughed, taking a can as he flopped down on the couch beside me. "What, you figured I'd be moping in my lonely bachelor pad?" He shrugged, cracking open his own can. "What are friends for? Besides, you've got to get back out there eventually. Can't let one lousy marriage ruin your whole outlook." I took a sip, nodding. "You're not wrong." We talked for a while, the conversation drifting from old stories to random observations about single life. He gave me some half-baked advice about dating apps, which I ignored, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a real smile tugging at my mouth. It wasn't much, just a night with a friend, a reminder that there was life beyond the walls I'd built for myself. The months that followed were a strange mix of routine and adjustment. Lauren and I settled into our co-parenting arrangement, and I gradually got used to the new rhythms of my life. I'd see the kids during the week, help them with their homework, drop them off at school. And when they weren't around, I found myself exploring a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. And then there was Lauren, who was adapting to her own new reality. Word had it that Alex, the soulmate, had bailed not long after our split went public. I caught a glimpse of her once or twice, looking a little more worn around the edges, a little less like the Lauren I'd known. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just resigned. She'd made her choices, and now, we were both living with the consequences. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I was sitting on the couch scrolling through the news when I came across an article on second chances. It was all about finding freedom after failure, full of cliched advice on forgiveness and self-discovery. I nearly skipped it, but a line caught my eye. "Sometimes, the best thing you can do isn't fixing the past, but finding the courage to start fresh." As I sat there in my half-furnished apartment, I realized I wasn't looking to fix anything. I wasn't looking to go back or even make sense of what Lauren had done. I was just ready to start something new, whatever that looked like. No expectations, no illusions, just the freedom of an open road stretching out ahead. And with that, I knew I'd finally let it all go. Months passed in a steady rhythm. Life didn't turn into a glamorous montage of single guy finds himself, nor did I dive into any grand new pursuits. It was simpler than that. I was working, co-parenting, and slowly rediscovering the pleasure of ordinary things I hadn't given a second thought in years. The kids were adapting better than I'd expected. They split their time between my place and Lauren's without too many questions or outbursts. They saw me more now than they had when I was in the same house, which felt odd but good. After a few weeks, they stopped asking why I left, stopped searching my face for explanations I didn't want to give. They just accepted it, in the way only kids can. Lauren, on the other hand, wasn't handling things quite as smoothly. Her big soulmate had apparently moved on within a few weeks of our split, leaving her with nothing but a handful of regrets and, if the gossip mill was accurate, a bit of embarrassment. Occasionally, she'd text me some vague suggestion about getting together or figuring things out, usually followed by a comment about how the kids missed having us all together. But I knew her well enough to recognize her messages for what they were, attempts to undo the mess she'd created without facing the consequences. I ignored her invitations. I was willing to co-parent peacefully, but that was where it ended. We'd carved out our separate spaces, and I was more than happy to keep it that way. One Saturday, about 6 months after I'd moved out, I decided to get out of the apartment and try something new. A friend of mine had been raving about a low-key wine tasting event at a little vineyard just outside the city, and it seemed like the kind of thing I'd once laughed off as pretentious nonsense. But with no one around to judge my choices, I figured, why not? I showed up to the vineyard, feeling a bit out of place among the clusters of couples and groups of friends swirling glasses and murmuring about notes of oak and hints of blackcurrant. I picked a spot at the bar, grabbing a sample of something red and faintly spicy. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was exactly where I wanted to be, anonymous, relaxed, and content to just drift along without any expectations. As I leaned against the bar, enjoying my second or third pour, I noticed someone looking in my direction. She was around my age, with a warm, open face and dark hair that spilled over her shoulders. She gave me a small smile, and before I could even process it, she was walking over. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice soft but confident. Not at all, I replied, gesturing to the seat beside me. She introduced herself as Rachel, an art history professor who, as it turned out, also found the wine-tasting scene mildly ridiculous. We fell into easy conversation, sharing stories about our jobs, trading sarcastic comments about the vineyard's rustic charm, and generally enjoying the lightness of conversation with a stranger. There was no baggage, no expectations. Just a relaxed exchange between two people with no ties, no shared past, no assumptions. The conversation lasted through several tastings, and by the end of the evening, I realized I was actually enjoying myself in a way I hadn't for years. When Rachel suggested exchanging numbers, I felt a small thrill of excitement, something I'd nearly forgotten I could feel. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and I started meeting for coffee, grabbing lunch here and there, and eventually, going out to dinners that had a bit more weight to them. She was sharp, funny, and had a way of seeing the world that was somehow refreshing and grounding. There were no grand declarations, no dizzying romantic gestures, just a genuine connection that grew naturally, without pressure or pretense. It was different from what I'd had with Lauren, and maybe that's what I liked best about it. With Rachel, I didn't feel like I was trying to prove anything or fit into a specific role. I could just be myself, whoever that was now. One evening, as we sat in a quiet little restaurant sharing a bottle of wine, Rachel looked at me thoughtfully. "You know, I get the feeling you've been through a lot lately," she said, her voice soft but probing. "You don't talk about it much, but it's there." I hesitated, caught off guard by her perceptiveness. I hadn't talked much about Lauren or the divorce with her. It wasn't that I was hiding it, I just didn't see the point. But now, looking across the table at someone who genuinely seemed to want to know, I felt a strange urge to let her in on the story. "Yeah," I said finally, swirling my wine as I thought of where to begin. "I suppose you could say that. My marriage didn't end on the best terms." She nodded, encouraging me to go on. I told her about Lauren, about the quiet years we'd spent building a life, about the betrayal that had crept in when I wasn't looking. I didn't go into detail, just enough to give her the outline, the bare bones of what had led me here. To her credit, she listened without judgment, without the kind of sympathetic platitudes that usually follow stories like mine. When I finished, she looked at me with a kind of understanding I hadn't expected. "It sounds like you did what you had to do," she said simply. "Sometimes that's all we can do." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. It was nice, sharing my story with someone who didn't have an opinion on how it should have gone, who didn't see it as a tragedy or a failure, just life. Rachel and I kept seeing each other, slowly and comfortably, with no rush to define what we were or where we were headed. It was a stark contrast to the whirlwind romance Lauren had thrown herself into. This felt real, grounded. Something built from a genuine interest in each other, rather than the thrill of escaping routine. Then one evening, just as I thought life had finally found a comfortable rhythm, my phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. Her texts were rare these days, mostly logistical reminders or quick updates about the kids. But this one had a different tone. "I know this is a lot to ask, but can we meet? Just once. I need closure, and I think you do too." I almost laughed. Closure? After everything, she wanted to sit down and dissect what had happened, as if understanding the wreckage would somehow make it easier to live with. I considered ignoring the message, but something stopped me. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was ready to see her, to finally look her in the eye and feel nothing. So I agreed to meet. The next day, I found myself sitting in coffee shop, waiting for Lauren to arrive. She walked in looking different. There was a tension in her face, a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before. She'd lost a bit of weight, and her usual polished appearance looked a little worn around the edges. She sat down across from me, giving me a tentative smile. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly. I nodded, waiting. She took a deep breath, folding her hands in front of her as if gathering herself. "Daniel, I don't expect you to forgive me," she began. "But I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. Truly. I don't know what I was thinking, throwing away everything we had. I know you won't take me back. I just wanted to say it." I watched her, feeling surprisingly detached. It was like looking at a stranger wearing my ex-wife's face, someone I barely recognized. "I appreciate that," I replied, my tone neutral. But we're past apologies, Lauren. We have our lives now. Let's focus on making the best of them for the kids. She nodded, her face falling slightly, as if she'd hoped for something more. But I didn't have anything left to give her. And for once, that felt fine. As we said our goodbyes, I walked out of that coffee shop without looking back, leaving her, and everything she represented, exactly where it belonged, in the past. After that final coffee with Lauren, it felt like I had officially turned the last page of a book I'd been stuck in for far too long. There was a strange peace in knowing I didn't owe her anything, not an apology, not forgiveness, and certainly not a second chance. We'd done what needed to be done for the kids, for the house, for our so-called closure. And now? Now I was free. With the weight of that chapter behind me, I found myself leaning more into my own life, my real life, the one I'd begun building without realizing it. I started taking on new projects at work, things I hadn't bothered to pursue before, too caught up in the daily routines to see that there was more out there. I spent more time with the kids, taking them on little adventures, just us three. We'd go to baseball games, take Saturday hikes, and even managed a weekend beach trip that turned into a chaotic, sand-covered success. And then there was Rachel. What had started as a casual friendship had slowly morphed into something steadier, something I didn't feel the need to overthink or question. Rachel and I didn't have grand plans or whirlwind passions. Instead, we had laughter over lazy Saturday mornings, impromptu dinners, and easy conversations that didn't need to prove anything. She understood where I was coming from without needing to dig too deep, and I liked that she had her own life, her own interests, and no desire to rush into something she wasn't ready for. We were just two people enjoying each other's company. It was simple. And maybe that's what made it so refreshing. One evening, after we'd been seeing each other for a few months, Rachel invited me to an art show her students were hosting. She taught at a local college, where she seemed to be a favorite among her students, a rare mix of sharp and warm that people were naturally drawn to. The gallery was buzzing with energy when we arrived, students proudly showing off their work, parents clapping them on the back, professors chatting in low, analytical tones. Rachel introduced me to a few people, and I could tell that they looked at me with a kind of quiet curiosity. I suppose they'd been used to seeing Rachel on her own for so long that my presence was something of a surprise. As we walked through the exhibit, Rachel pointed out pieces with a critical eye, explaining the techniques her students had used and what they were aiming for. I found myself watching her as much as the artwork, fascinated by the way she could read each piece, find meaning in every brushstroke or angle. It was a side of her I hadn't seen before, a glimpse into her world that I found myself wanting to know more about. At one point, she turned to me, catching me in the act of watching her. She smiled, a little shyly. "What? Am I boring you with all this art talk?" "Not at all," I replied, shaking my head. "I think it's incredible how you can see all that in a painting. I'd probably just say, nice colors." She laughed, nudging me playfully. "It's a skill, I suppose. Years of training to be pretentious about color palettes and composition. But there was more than that, and we both knew it. Rachel had a way of seeing things, really seeing them, that I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. With her, the world felt just a little more vibrant, like I was slowly learning to pay attention again. By the time fall rolled around, things had settled into a new kind of normal. The kids were thriving, adjusting well to the new arrangement. They didn't ask questions about Lauren and me anymore. They'd simply accepted that we had two homes now, two lives that coexisted in their own way. Lauren and I managed a civil co-parenting relationship, coordinating holidays, school events, and birthdays with the efficiency of two people who knew each other well but were no longer invested in each other's lives. One weekend, I had the kids over, and we planned a camping trip, a simple one, nothing too intense, just a few nights in a cabin by the lake, where we could fish, hike, and roast marshmallows over a fire. Rachel came along, and though I was a little nervous at first about blending my worlds, it ended up feeling surprisingly natural. The kids took to her right away. She had an easy way of talking to them, treating them not like his kids, but like people she genuinely wanted to get to know. She helped them set up the fishing poles, even managed to teach my youngest how to catch a fish without scaring it off. Watching her interact with them was one of those quiet, unexpected moments that made me realize how far I'd come. One night, as we sat around the fire, the kids drifted off to sleep in their sleeping bags, and Rachel and I found ourselves sitting in the glow of the dying embers. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for a long time, we just sat there, watching the stars flicker in the inky sky. Eventually, she broke the silence. "This is nice, you know. Just being here." I nodded, feeling a wave of contentment wash over me. "It really is." She looked up at me, a glimmer of something in her eyes. "Do you ever think about where this is all going?" I paused, considering her question. I knew what she meant, and I appreciated that she wasn't pushing, wasn't expecting anything. But in that moment, I realized that, for the first time in a long time, I actually had an answer. "Honestly, I don't know exactly where it's going. But I do know I want you in it." She smiled, a warm, genuine smile that felt like a quiet promise. We didn't need to say much more. Sitting there in the stillness, with the stars overhead and the world falling away, I felt a sense of certainty that didn't need any big declarations. It was enough just to know that we were on the same page, whatever that meant. The next morning, as we packed up, the kids chattered about the fish they'd caught, the stories we told around the fire, and the marshmallows they'd burned to perfection. Rachel and I exchanged a knowing glance, each of us quietly aware that this was more than just a camping trip. It was a step forward, small but meaningful, something to build on. As we drove back, Rachel reached over, slipping her hand into mine. I felt a warmth there, a quiet reassurance that life could be rebuilt, reshaped, and maybe even better than it was before. A few weeks later, as I sat in my apartment alone one evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. It was short, a simple update about the kids, ending with, "Glad to hear you're doing well, Daniel." "I really am." I stared at the message for a moment, a wave of emotions flickering through me, sadness, nostalgia, and maybe a touch of gratitude. I typed out a brief reply, something polite, neutral, and put the phone down. I looked around my apartment, taking in the place that had become more than just a stopgap in my life. It was home now, in the way that mattered most. And it was a home where I could finally breathe, finally be myself without the weight of old expectations. That evening, I called Rachel, just to hear her voice, to tell her about my day, to ask if she wanted to meet up later for a late-night coffee. She laughed, saying, "Only if you don't mind listening to me ramble about art for an hour." I chuckled, settling into the couch, feeling that rare and precious peace that comes when you finally find your footing. "Rachel," I said, smiling, "I wouldn't have it any other way." Over the next few months, life began to settle in ways that felt refreshingly ordinary and genuinely fulfilling. My relationship with Rachel continued to grow at its own pace. We didn't make grand plans or talk about forever, and that was part of the beauty of it. For once, my life was mine to shape, and I could enjoy it without the weight of someone else's expectations. Lauren and I kept our co-parenting routine simple, staying cordial for the kids. Occasionally, she'd still send messages or comments that hinted at regret, as if part of her hoped I'd eventually soften and let her back in. But each time, I kept my responses neutral, polite, giving her no room for hope or ambiguity. That door was closed, and I had no intention of opening it again. I was building something better for myself, and for the first time, I wasn't looking back. One Saturday, as I was cleaning up my apartment, my phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. This time, it wasn't a request to meet up or another attempt to open old wounds. It was a simple reminder about our daughter's school play, with a note, "The kids would love to see you there. I know I'll be going, so maybe we can both be there." I sighed, glancing around my cluttered apartment. Part of me wanted to avoid it, to let Lauren handle the school play on her own, but that wasn't fair to the kids. They deserved my support and presence, and if that meant showing up and keeping things civil with Lauren, so be it. I texted back a quick, "I'll be there," and put it out of my mind. That evening, I arrived at the school auditorium, taking a seat a few rows from the front. I'd made it early, so I didn't have to cross paths with Lauren, who arrived with her usual punctuality. I watched her find her seat, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a quiet sense of indifference. She glanced over, giving a polite nod. I returned it, then turned my attention to the stage, not feeling the slightest pang of nostalgia or regret. It was like watching an old scene play out from the other side of the glass. The play was charming, the kids' performances as endearing as you'd expect. Seeing my daughter's excitement on stage made every awkward interaction with Lauren worth it. She waved at me from behind the curtain, her face lighting up when she spotted me, and I gave her an exaggerated thumbs up that made her giggle. As the show ended and the crowd began to disperse, I made my way to the exit, content to slip out quietly and avoid any post-show small talk. But as I turned to leave, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Lauren, holding a program in one hand, her expression hesitant. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice softer than usual. "It means a lot to them. To all of us." I nodded, giving her a brief smile. They did a great job. It was good to see them so happy. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for something, maybe a sign of warmth or forgiveness that just wasn't there. "Daniel, I know it's been a while since everything happened. I just wanted you to know that I'm glad you found someone." I froze, taken aback. Lauren had never mentioned Rachel before, and for a second, I wondered how she even knew. But it didn't matter. Her tone wasn't bitter. If anything, she sounded resigned, even relieved. "Thanks, Lauren," I replied, carefully measured. "I appreciate that." A small, sad smile crossed her face. "I've had a lot of time to think, you know? I thought I needed something different, but in the end, I lost what really mattered." She looked down, then added, almost in a whisper, "I know I can't undo it. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." The words landed with a strange finality. They weren't the first apology she'd given, but something in her voice told me they were real this time. She'd stopped hoping for a second chance. She'd simply accepted that this was our reality now, and she was ready to live with it. "I appreciate that, Lauren. I really do," I said, keeping my tone gentle but firm. "But I think we're both better off this way." She nodded, a faint look of acceptance in her eyes. For the first time, it felt like we'd both let go, each of us moving forward on our own paths. The following weekend, I planned a small gathering at my apartment to celebrate my son's birthday. Rachel joined us, blending seamlessly into the scene. She brought a homemade cake and showed up with the same relaxed smile that had won me over months ago. My kids adored her by now, and watching her joke with them, laughing as they talked her into a game of charades, I felt a sense of calm settle over me that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. Toward the end of the night, after the kids had gone to bed, Rachel and I sat on the couch, enjoying the last sips of wine. She leaned her head on my shoulder, her fingers laced through mine. "You know," she murmured, "I never thought I'd get to this place with someone. But here we are." "Same here," I replied, my voice soft. "I didn't even know I was looking for this until I found it." She looked up at me, her eyes warm. "It's amazing, isn't it? How life can take a turn you didn't expect and lead you somewhere better." I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude that went beyond words. For the first time, I felt as though I'd made it to the other side of a journey I hadn't even realized I'd started. I'd built a life on my own terms, with people who genuinely mattered to me, people who made me want to show up every day and just be myself. A few weeks later, as the holiday season approached, Rachel and I made plans for a quiet celebration with the kids. Nothing extravagant, just a simple dinner, a small tree, and a few thoughtful gifts. As we decorated together, my son struggling to wrap a gift as Rachel gently helped him, I felt a warmth in the room that filled every corner of my small apartment. When the kids went to bed that night, Rachel and I sat by the tree, the only light coming from the soft glow of the colored bulbs. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat in silence, listening to the hum of the city outside, content and at peace. "You know," I said after a while, "I never thought I'd be here again. Not like this." She smiled, squeezing my hand. "Neither did I. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising us." In that moment, I realized that while I couldn't control the way things had ended with Lauren, I could choose how my life would look moving forward. I'd found a quiet kind of happiness here, something real, something built from the ashes of what I'd lost. And that was enough. As the clock struck midnight, Rachel and I toasted to new beginnings and to the unexpected twists that had brought us together. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I was finally where I was meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. As the months passed, life found a steady rhythm. Weekends with the kids, quiet dinners with Rachel, work projects that kept me just busy enough. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was just existing or going through the motions. I was genuinely living, and the simplicity of it was almost startling. Rachel and I kept things easy and honest, with no rush to label or define what we had. She stayed over once in a while, sometimes joining in on our small family gatherings. And though I knew she cared about me, she had her own life, her own friends, her own space. I liked that. It made me realize that relationships didn't have to consume every corner of your world to be real or meaningful. Lauren had mostly faded into the background by then. We spoke only when necessary, coordinating schedules for the kids or exchanging quick updates. Our conversations were cordial, functional. She hadn't tried to reach out for anything more since that day at the coffee shop, and for that, I was grateful. I knew she'd moved on too, in her own way. We both had. One morning, about a year after I'd moved out, I received an unexpected message from her. The kids are asking if we could all go out for dinner, just once. They miss the four of us together. No pressure. Just thought I'd ask. I sat with the text for a moment, wondering if this was really about the kids or some last attempt to rekindle a spark that had long since burned out. But after a bit of consideration, I realized there was no harm in granting the kids' wish, just this once. We were their parents, after all, and if a simple meal together gave them some comfort, it was worth it. So I agreed, suggesting a neutral family-friendly spot where we could keep things light and easy. When the evening came, Lauren and I settling into an unspoken truce. She seemed a little nervous, glancing at me now and then with a mix of curiosity and something I couldn't quite place. But we kept it civil with smiles that hinted at something like peace, if not warmth. The kids bouncing with excitement, talking a mile a minute, thrilled to have both their parents together. And as the evening went on, I found myself relaxing, laughing along with them, slipping into the comfortable banter that had once been second nature. For the kids, at least, it was as if no time had passed. They were happy, and for a couple of hours, that was enough. Toward the end of the meal, as the kids were absorbed in their dessert, Lauren turned to me with a quiet, almost wistful smile. "Thank you for this, Daniel," she said softly. "It means a lot." I nodded, meeting her gaze. The kids wanted it. I'm glad we could give them this. She looked as if she wanted to say something more, but instead, she just smiled, a hint of acceptance in her eyes. In that moment, I felt the finality settle in between us, not with bitterness, but with a kind of mutual understanding. We'd both moved on, each of us building a new life in our own way. There was nothing left to regret, nothing left to apologize for. As we said our goodbyes, she gave me a nod, her eyes holding a trace of gratitude that felt genuine, unspoken. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if that last lingering thread had finally been tied off. I'd thought I needed a grand gesture, some moment of reckoning, but all it had taken was a simple dinner to let it go. The weeks that followed were filled with the comfortable routines that had come to define my new life. Rachel and I continued seeing each other, our bond growing stronger with every quiet moment, every shared laugh. I could tell she understood where I'd been, but more importantly, she understood where I was going. With her, the future felt open, expansive, not because of any grand plans but because of the possibilities we'd both left unspoken. One evening, after a particularly long week at work, Rachel invited me over for a quiet night in. She had a stack of movies, a bottle of wine, and that easy smile that could make even the most draining day feel worth it. We spent the night curled up on her couch, laughing at old comedies, talking about everything and nothing, letting the comfort of each other's presence say more than words could. As the credits rolled on some old film neither of us had really been watching, she turned to me, her eyes warm and steady. "You know, I think you've finally let it all go," she said softly, a hint of admiration in her voice. I nodded, feeling the truth of it. "I think so too." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for a long time, we sat there in silence, content just to be. In that quiet, I realized I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward, building something that was mine and mine alone, a life that was no longer defined by the past or by the pieces of myself I'd once left behind. A few months later, Rachel and I planned a small trip together. Nothing extravagant, just a weekend getaway to a cabin by the lake, somewhere quiet, where we could disconnect from everything else and enjoy the simplicity of being together. It was the kind of trip of escape that felt like a reward for everything I'd gone through. We spent the days hiking, laughing, telling each other stories that didn't need to be anything but real. And at night, under a sky scattered with stars, we'd sit by the fire, wrapped in blankets, sharing dreams and plans we hadn't even realized we'd been holding back. On the last night, as we sat by the lake in the dark, she reached for my hand, her voice soft and steady. "Daniel, do you ever think about more?" I smiled, feeling a warmth that went beyond the firelight. "Yeah. I think I could get used to more." We didn't need any promises, any declarations. Just knowing that we wanted to keep building this, whatever this was enough. As we sat there, our hands entwined, I felt the calmness of the lake settle into me, a peace that ran deep, like the roots of something that had finally found its place. I knew the journey hadn't been easy. I'd lost, I'd learned, and I'd let go. But now I had something far better. A life that was mine, a love that was real, and a future that, for the first time, felt full of possibility. And as the stars sparkled above us, I finally felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.